go. Okay, thanks very much. So for our next presentation, we have Cristina Vanin coming to us from St. Jerome's University of Waterloo. And her talk is entitled "Wisdom of Indigenous Worldviews as Key to an Integral Ecology." If you join me in welcoming Cristina.
I was reflecting over lunch that we've heard lots of words and said lots of words, and we still have more words, so here we go. It's one of the things about being the person in the afternoon on the last day, one of the people on the afternoon on the last day. In starting, I want to bring here, present to mind, the Anishinaabe, the Attawandaron, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. They are the traditional caretakers of the land where I live and work. That land is referred to as the Haldeman Tract. It's about 10 kilometers or 6 miles for those of you that need that translation, on each side of the Grand River, which is a wonderful, amazing river that goes from sort of mid-Ontario down to Lake Erie. I also want to thank Ben and Joseph and everyone who's just making this colloquium possible, and I'm really glad I was able to be here in person and engage in these conversations. And I have to say, after yesterday, just thank you to those of you that are engaging with ideas that Neil and I put out in our paper. That was a humbling experience for me, a new experience. Very humbling but very inspiring and very energizing. Neil and I right now are working on taking that article and making it into a book, so this gives me for sure, new energy on that. So thank you. It's very humbling. I'm glad that some of you are finding some help with what we put out there. I really appreciate what Ryan did this morning. I haven't done that. It's appealing to me, but my main interest today is to put in front of you some of the voices, Indigenous voices, 2 of them out of Canada, and if I have time to get to the third, then we'll get to the third. If not, that's fine. And just what I'm hearing from those people, what I'm learning. But I want to first set a little bit of context about how do I find myself getting to the place where I'm really trying to be intentional about listening to Indigenous voices. So this is where I got to remember to do 2 things at one time. How's that working? Yeah, it worked. So I'm going to bring into the conversation Thomas Berry, because he's a major influence in my life and my thinking and my even being concerned about anything to do with the natural world. He was writing about the ecological, what he always referred to as the ecological crisis, from about the 1970s, 80s. He's a cultural historian by training, passionist priest. And I've always been struck by how much he talks about the human alienation from the natural world, and will often say that alienation is so extensive that we're often, as human beings, not even aware. So I'm going to read a little bit of this quotation that's up there and add a little bit more to it. While we have more scientific knowledge of the universe than any people ever had, it's not the type of knowledge that leads to intimate presence within a meaningful universe. Our children no longer learn how to read the great book of nature from their own direct experience. They seldom learn where their water comes from or where it goes. We no longer coordinate our human celebrations with the great liturgy of the heavens. We no longer hear the voices of the rivers, the mountains, or the sea. The world about us has become an it rather than a thou. What's happening?
You're muted.
Well, that's not helpful. Well, it's okay for me, but well, you'll catch up. I wanted to bring Barry back because he, way before Laudato Si, has been talking about Indigenous wisdom and the importance of it. And that how key Indigenous wisdom would be to overcoming this alienation of, and he would use this language of dialoguing with Indigenous people. And he characterizes Indigenous wisdom as being distinguished by intimacy with and participation in the functioning of the natural world. So I was hearing that language for me, from the late 1980s up till now. Barry also always said that those of us who have grown up in what we now are calling, he wouldn't have used this language, but here we go. He would just say a Christian worldview, but a Western colonial worldview. He would say we're quite estranged from an Indigenous consciousness. And in fact, that it can be very difficult, and maybe we've just begun to realize how little we really understand Indigenous peoples and how much we need their wisdom. And that's me. I mean, I've been engaged with him and his thinking for decades now, and have read this and said this and written about this, but I haven't really sought to understand that wisdom and to really dialogue with Indigenous people. And then more recently, Pope Francis, I'm not going to, I don't know how many times we've heard now, paragraph 146, and where he just, in the midst of this whole, this reference comes up in the chapter on integral ecology, and that Indigenous people need to be our primary dialogue partners. I just say that when I was reflecting on this, I mean, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of this encyclical letter, and I was thinking, so what actually has been going on? You know, so the Pope says things, what is he doing or not doing, or what is he supporting or not supporting? So I was paying attention to a few things. One, that there was in 2019, there was a study seminar that took place that titled Indigenous Peoples, Custodians of Nature, Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So that took place, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization has headquarters in Rome, so it was there. And Francis addresses and welcomes and talks to anybody who's having these conversations, so you can always go online and find those. And then in 2021, the FAO held study days on Indigenous food systems. In 2024, the two pontifical academies, the one of the sciences and the one of the social sciences, held a joint workshop on Indigenous people's knowledge and the sciences, subtitled Combining Knowledge and Science on Vulnerabilities and Solutions to Resilience. And when Pope Francis addressed to the people coming to that workshop, he said, your workshop represents an opportunity to grow in reciprocal listening. Listening to Indigenous peoples in order to learn from their wisdom and from their lifestyles, and at the same time, listening to scientists in order to benefit from their research. Not surprising that given this whole years now of synod on synodality and a whole approach of listening, very Ignatian, that this is very much in the way that Francis operates. And this past February 2025, he welcomed the participants in the 7th meeting of the Forum of Indigenous People, and they met to discuss Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination as a pathway for food security and sovereignty. So I have some consolation that there are conversations, dialogue is happening in places. I think it freezes up a little bit. Okay. And then this is just to highlight that this is part of the background, is just the dialectic of culture that Bob Doran has worked on. And let me just remind us of some of the things in that. This is not an extensive thing. This is bringing to the forefront some of what's affected me in my thinking. So a society is healthy to the extent that, he says, that the dialectic of community is healthy. That is, to the extent that there's a healthy dialectical tension between spontaneous intersubjectivity and practical intelligence. Genuine cultural values can ensure the integrity of this dialectic, and so attention to the need for genuine cultural values pushes us to consider the dialectic of culture. He draws on Eric Voegelin and argues that the dialectic of culture is a dialectic of contraries. On the one hand, cosmological, constitutive meaning, and on the other, anthropological constitutive meaning. So in the dialectic, both poles are to be affirmed, and like the other dialectics that he discusses, the integrity of this dialectic is a function of the concrete unfolding of both sets of insights and meanings. So, the cosmological pole meanings values are drawn from the natural rhythms of the cosmos and the cycles of nature. And so that cosmic order is reflected in the order of our society within which each of us as individuals finds ourselves. And then the other side of the dialectic, the anthropological pole, draws meanings and values from a source of reason that transcends this world. And so insight moves from God through individuals to society. As with any of the dialectics, the distortion of the dialectic of culture would involve, as Doran himself says, anthropological consciousness losing affective sympathy with nature as it constitutes history, or cosmological consciousness succumbing massively to a fatalism that it supposes is inscribed in cosmic rhythms. So one of the things that's in our article is, what we said in our article is that today we find ourselves in a distorted dialectic of culture, in which the anthropological culture dominates to the point that cosmological meanings and values are not simply neglected, but often ridiculed. And Laudato Si deals with a significant impact of this distortion in our time. So because human beings regard themselves as masters of the earth, Pope Francis says, the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of the poor. And then, we'll see which one works. I'm not going to say a lot. You heard from Reid this morning about some of the context and some of what's influenced Reid's engagement with Indigenous wisdom is some of what's also affected me. So I've been aware of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work in Canada and its 94 calls to action, which came out in 2015. But I would say like many other settler Canadians, didn't really pay attention to what those calls to action were saying and didn't really begin to respond until many, I think, of us did in 2021. And in Canada in 2021, that's when ground-penetrating radar led to the discovery of a number of sites, a number of graves at sites of former residential schools, which has really brought the residential schools back into the forefront of our culture's thinking. And then, as Reid highlighted, in 2022, we had this quite remarkable a set of delegation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit representatives went to Rome in March, and then I think in record-breaking Vatican time, by July, the Pope is coming to Canada for a pilgrimage of penance. And an apologies in Rome, which nobody expected. And then when he visited, every site that he visited in Canada was a site important to Indigenous people, and at every one of those sites, among all the things that he said, he offered profound apologies. So that's a background to what has finally pushed me in the last few years to listen more intently or more intentionally, more attentively to Indigenous voices, to begin to try to do my best to dialogue with Indigenous people, particularly in Canada, because I really would like to learn what they can teach me about being an integral presence on this earth. So, I wanted to share 3 voices that I've been listening to and paying attention to. Not in the way that Ryan is doing it, but I'm doing it as the academic who reads books and chapters and articles, but doesn't have opportunities for conversation, but not as often as I like. I'm going to start with John Borrows. John Borrows is a member of the Chippewa of the Nawash First Nation in Ontario, Canada. He's also the Loveland Chair in Indigenous Law at the Faculty of Law in the University of Toronto. So, I found he edited. I mean, I've heard him speak and stuff, but I found an essay in a volume that he helped to edit, and I went looking because I was curious what he was saying. Because he said, "Earthbound, semicolon, indigenous resurgence and environmental reconciliation," and that caught me because in terms of all the chapters in this edited volume, this is the one talking about Earth, and I thought, what is John doing with that? And he says pretty much at the outset of his chapter that it's key for Indigenous people to have some resurgence in their relations with the natural world. Because again, as you heard, the basically wiping out or doing our best in Canada to wipe out their culture, their languages and so on means that Indigenous people in Canada also are in a process of reconciling and regaining their relationship with the natural world, revitalizing their relationships with rocks and water and insects and plants and birds and animals and all forms of life. And so I was struck because John says that there is no reconciliation with peoples, between peoples, which is the big work in Canada, right? Truth and reconciliation, unless there's also reconciliation with the land. And so that sat with me. And I've been trying to see what can the work that he's doing in trying to probe that, what can I learn from that? So Burroughs learned, and he's a trained lawyer, but he also learned about his own Anishinaabe law from one of his elders, Dr. Basil Johnston, who taught him that we learn how to live well by giving our attention to the earth and taking direction from the earth. Paying attention and taking direction. And so he says, quote, "Indigenous legal traditions embody rich and vibrant insights and include deep intellectual and social resources that can help us care for the natural world." And he talks about the treaties that his own ancestors signed, the Anishinaabe signed, and when they signed them, they said that they agreed to share all millions of acres of land in where I live, which is what we call the province of Ontario. And they agreed to share, and this is the phrase they use, "for as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows." So let me unpack that a little bit for you. So the search here that John is doing and working with in his learning and the teaching from Basil Johnston is looking, right, listening to the land, paying attention to the land, and what can we learn from the land about how we are to live. So, as long as the sun shines, what are the important metaphors for life in Anishinaabe descriptions of the sun? And I'm going to apologize because I don't know how to speak Anishinaabe and I'll do my best. So, the sun in Anishinaabe is the word giziz, and it represents light, warmth, heat, and sight. So, Burroughs says, the sun stimulates growth. What does that say to us about how to live? Then we are expected to help others to grow. When the sun shines, it falls on everyone without discrimination. This teaches us that we are obligated to practice and apply the earth-based laws without any discrimination. The sun's path through the sky represents steadiness and predictability. This teaches us to be steady and dependable. The fire of the sun enkindles life. Plants, insects, birds, animals, humans wouldn't exist without the fire of the sun. This encourages us to revive those who lack vitality, and it teaches us about sustainability. Water, as long as the rivers flow. The word for water in Anishinaabe is nibi. And properly understood, it means, and we heard this morning, I am life. So water is life, water is living, it has an agency and a life force of its own. So John does a little bit of a, what could this look like? Because in other countries, they're looking to give legal status of personhood to rivers and other bodies of water. So he says, what could this look like, and what does this mean in the Canadian context? So he looks at the mouth of the Credit River. It's in western Toronto, just west of Toronto, and it was a place of an ancient council fire. It's situated in what a city. I think it's a city now, and it has the name Mississauga. And that name, Mississauga, comes from this site of an ancient council fire. It means the large river mouth. Micha, large, Zagin river mouth. Interestingly, Zagin also means love in Anishinaabe. So, Micha Zagi is the place of great love. So, in the eyes of Anishinaabe law, you can see analogies here between this living being, because for the Anishinaabe, the rivers are living beings, who can teach us about love. So, love like a river should carry sustenance. It should continually flow to sustain all those around us. Its current should be strong and lay down layers of nourishment as the forces of life course through us and strengthen others. The mouths of river are places of abundance because they collect nutrients from the surrounding land and they deliver that energy to the plants, to medicines, insects, birds, animals, and to all people who thrive at the mouth of rivers. And so like the mouth of a river, love is strongest where it meets other people. Others, sorry, not just people, all beings. Love helps us to fortify those around us. It creates a rich, varied, diverse, and abundant life. And so for the Anishinaabe, love is a binding legal obligation learned from the rivers, and it's an aspect of treaty relationships. As long as the grass grows. One word for grass in Anishinaabe is meyash kushag. For the Anishinaabe, grass is medicine. And I'm learning that means it has much to teach us. So not medicine the way my Western head tends to think about it. It has something much to teach us. So the Anishinaabe understand it to be the strength of the earth. So Boro says it's important to recognize that the budding and the growing of grass, to think about that budding and growing as, again, principles in the treaties that the Anishinaabe have signed. They were embedded there in the relationships from the Indigenous perspective. And so he argues that we haven't remembered these promises that were there in the treaties that were signed to learn from the earth and to help one another as we should. We fail to offer gifts of reciprocity and respect in our relationships. So among the various duties to one another is the duties to act in ways here that are healing and life-affirming. For as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows. This is something that I was introduced to recently. As Reed said, I'm on the SHRC grant. We're on different groups that are meeting, and the group that I'm working with right now, we are exploring together and trying to understand what it means to think of land as relative. And so Jeanette Armstrong was one of the people that we read. So she is a Sikhs Okanagan, I'm not going to be able to pronounce her, she's a fluent speaker of her native language. She's a traditional knowledge keeper of the Okanagan Nation and a founder of Enalkeen, which is a knowledge revitalization institution of higher learning. Right now, she holds the Canada Research Chair in Okanagan Indigenous Knowledge and Philosophy at UBC, University of British Columbia, Okanagan. And so we looked at an essay that she wrote called Land Speaking. And she discusses in that article her experience as an Okanagan who is indigenous to the land she lives on. And how does that experience permeate her writing. Her Okanagan ancestors taught her that language was given to them by the land. And the land that she lives on is part of the Great Columbia River Basin on the interior plateau of Washington State and British Columbia. So she talks about how her elders say that it is the land that holds all knowledge, including knowledge of life and death, that the land is a constant teacher. The land is constantly communicating, constantly speaking. And her peoples have survived and thrived by listening intently to the teachings of the land, to its language. And then they invented the human words to try to retell the stories that the land was speaking to succeeding generations of the Okanagan. So here's some language that I find striking, that I'm trying to imagine even how I could even put this into my own framework of thinking. Armstrong speaks of herself as claimed and owned by this Okanagan land. Claimed and owned by land. She experiences the land as language that completely surrounds her. And within the vast speaking, she says, that is the land speaking. Human beings are an inextricable part, though a minute part, of the language of the land. And she says the voices that move when she listens are not, don't emerge as words. They move within as colors, patterns, movements of the landscape. So the words come after the experience. She refers to them as grandmother voices. So I just want to read to you a little bit. She wrote a beautiful poem called Grandmothers, but I'm just going to read a little excerpt from it. The Okanagan word for grandmother means something like loving, ancestor, land, spirit. A whole bunch of things combined into one. In the part of me that was always there, grandmothers are speaking to me. The grandmothers in whose voices I nestle and draw nourishment from. Voices speaking to me in early light, glinting off water, speaking to me in fragile green, pushing upward. I lift my eyes and know I am seed and shooting green and words in this hollow. I am might glittering, the wind and silence. I am vastness stretching to the sun. I am this moment, earth mind. And yet I am small, a mote of dust, hardly here, unbearably without anything to hold me but the voices of grandmothers. Robin Wall-Kimmerer has come into this room before, and she's coming back. Kimmerer describes herself as a mother, scientist, decorated professor, enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. She lives in Syracuse, New York, where she is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center of Native Peoples in the Environment. Now, here's a botanist and an Indigenous person trying to share what is the wisdom, right? So one of the stories or chapters in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, subtitle I think is important, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. One of them is called The Gift of Strawberries, which I use in my classes on religion and ecology. And in that story, she talks about Evan Peter, a Gwich'in man, who introduces himself as, quote, a boy who was raised by a river, end quote. Does this mean that he grew up near the banks of a river? Does it mean that the river is responsible for raising him? for teaching him things that he needed to in order to live? Kimmerer suggests that perhaps both of those meanings are true. That indeed we could hardly have one meaning without the other. And so as I keep talking here, I'm going to invite you to think, what would you answer to the question, who raised you? And the who is intentional, as I'm understanding it from... So Kimmerer describes herself. I think I resonate with this story because of what she says about herself. She describes herself as someone who was raised by strawberries, fields of strawberries. And I just, June is too far away from me. I'm waiting for, yeah. She says, it was the wild strawberries beneath dewy lives on an almost summer morning who gave me my sense of the world, of my place in the world. It was strawberries that first shaped my view of a world that is full of gifts scattered at your feet. My role is to be open-eyed and present to those gifts. So, John Boros teaches me something about thinking about law. Janelle Armstrong just thinking about language and what are we hearing? Where do we find meaning? And Kimmerer's got me thinking a bit about economics. So when she describes her experiences with strawberries, she says, these were also experiences of a gift economy. She says, I learned that gifts from the earth or from each other establish a particular relationship, an obligation of sorts to give, to receive, to reciprocate. No person taught us this. The strawberries showed us this. Because they had given us a gift, then an ongoing relationship opened up between us. Our gift back to the strawberries was time, attention, care, and red-stained fingers. Heartberries indeed. I love that. In the summer, her community, the Potawatomi, gather for powwows and ceremony. One ceremony that she talks about is the traditional giveaway ceremony, the Minidoak, I think. In the ceremony, the hosts are the ones who give gifts. They pile blankets high, blankets are spread out, and they're piled high with all kinds of gifts to share with everyone who comes into the circle. And berries are always present at this ceremony. And she says, one big bowl, one big spoon are passed around the circle so that each person can taste the sweetness, remember the gifts, and say thank you. The berries carry the lesson passed to us by our ancestors, that the generosity of the land comes to us as one bowl, one spoon. The gifts of the earth are to be shared, but gifts are not limitless. Okay. The generosity of the earth is not an invitation to take it all. Every bowl has a bottom. When it's empty, and there is but one spoon, the same size for all. There's another, I'm not going to talk about the grammar of animacy, another chapter, and that one's very interesting about, again, learning to speak the language of the place where we are in order, if you're going to be native to a place, then you need to learn to speak to that place and that language. So just to say that for me, all of these explorations are, they really are confirmations for me of what I've learned from Thomas Berry, what Laudato Si opens up for me, that there really is in human beings a deep intimacy with the natural world, but for many of us, we've lost that intimacy, or I like Berry's language of alienated. And so the work to remember, deeply remember and recover that intimacy is what I'm striving to find here. And I'm still sitting with how little I really understand, but I'm just so drawn to engage in the dialogue. So thank you for listening.
We're a little bit pressed on time, but perhaps we could take one question. For this one?
Yeah, just have a very practical question. What was that other Robin Wall Kimmerer book you mentioned at the end, The Grammar of what?
The Grammar of Animacy is another one of the chapters in Breeding Sweetgrass.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
There are lots of wonderful chapters in that book. Anyway, that was another one that I was, because she's talking about language and language of the land and how to, yeah. And I find it quite striking because, not that John Burroughs doesn't talk about this, but Jeanette Armstrong and us are talking about how a number of indigenous languages seem to be very verb-based languages. She says her own, Kimmerer's own her language, like 70% of the words are verbs. And in English, she says it's about 30%. And as a scientist, it's like she has, it's like, what do I do with this? To be a bay, to be a sun, to be a sky. Well, how do I? And she talks about this wonderful, and that I say, a wonderful moment of insight, where she said, the synapses flowed, I get it. And something shifted in her, that her own appreciation and learning about what the verb base of her own language might be trying to teach her, even as a scientist. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah.
If you'll join me in thanking Cristina.